Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. A liberal society is necessarily an open and diverse one. When people are free to move and free to choose, a country's population and culture will reflect all those differences in tastes, preferences, and ways of living. And that's part of what makes liberalism so great. But a pluralistic society can be bothersome for those who prefer everyone be just like them. And if those sorts get uncomfortable enough with cultural diversity and dynamism, they can turn against liberalism itself. To help think through these tensions, and how liberalism can defend itself against those who would rather it weren't so diverse, I brought on my friend Jacob Levy. He's the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory at McGill University and author of the terrific book Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported project. If you like the show and want to get early access to new episodes, consider becoming a supporter. You can learn more and sign up for the free newsletter companion to this podcast by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. And stick around to the end of today's episode for a preview of my next discussion, available now in early access for supporters. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Jacob. We are recording this now 2 days after the Republican National Convention featured a whole lot of people waving signs, slickly produced signs, I should say. This was something that was clearly handed out by leadership at the convention, signs that said mass deportation now, which was horrifying and depressing, and makes me want to talk about pluralism. What does it mean to say that ours is, or I suppose ought to be, a pluralistic society?
I'm going to struggle with this one for a second. All modern societies, all liberal societies are, in at least some senses, pluralistic. And that doesn't have to mean that there's any sense of valuing of the pluralism. There's just a descriptive fact. We have societies in which people disagree about political questions, disagree about religious questions. We have societies in which people pursue a variety of ways of life, live in very economically differentiated circumstances. And people talk about pluralism as a modern fact as distinguished from a kind of idealized vision of an integrated, holistic life, especially in Catholic medieval Europe, where everyone was leading the same way of life. That is to say, essentially, everyone was engaged in subsistence farming, with small exceptions in the cities and in the upper classes. Everyone subscribed to the same religious creed, and there's no real need for political contestation. All of those things get transformed over the course of modernity, and liberal democracies are societies that are committed to building on and facilitating and respecting all of those kinds of pluralism that develop. The pluralism of the ways of life, the pluralism of the kinds of economic engagement, pluralism about ways of engaging with religion or the lack of religion, and pluralism about political commitments. In a sense, the least philosophically difficult is a plurality of ethno-national or linguistic backgrounds, things that we talk about now as being the defining hard fact about national identity. Those are, in a variety of senses, easier to come to terms with intellectually or morally or philosophically than the differences about how we should live together, how we relate to God. But they've proven to be extremely difficult to come to terms with in light of the political force of nationalism and the urge to national homogeneity. So on top of all those other kinds of pluralism that I just talked about, we've started to really try to come to grips with having national political identities that are pluralistic, that are multiracial, that are multi-ethnic, that are multicultural, that are multilinguistic, whatever the sources of that pluralism within the citizenry is. Contrast, for example, the pluralism of descendants of different kinds of European 19th and early 20th century immigrants to the racial pluralism of the coexistence, to begin with, of whites in the United States and African Americans descended from those who were brought here in conditions of slavery, with the added then racial complexity of increased migration from Asia and Latin America over the course of the latter part of the 20th century. Now, I would say, in order to really think of a society as pluralistic, we mean not just the descriptive fact. We mean that we treat that as a neutral to positive fact, not a problem to solve. Often it's neutral, but that it's neutral means that it should not be negative. That it's neutral means that it should not be an occasion for political violence to try to suppress, or urges to expel, or urges to forcibly homogenize. And of course, all of that comes into conflict with the politics of ethno-nationalism, white nationalism, and Christian nationalism that we're seeing so ascendant in the United States right now.
Yeah, I gave a presentation on pluralism and toleration a couple of days ago. And one of the ways that I framed it was pluralism is both a fact of the world, like you can describe it. It's a statement about the quantity of diversity and the possibility of cultural dynamism, because I don't think you can be pluralistic if you're like, I like the diversity right now, but I don't want it to ever change. And but it's also it's a value and it's a perspective that you look upon the world in a pluralistic way, that you look upon the world valuing that diversity and that dynamism. Is this what distinguishes pluralism from tolerance? Because tolerance seems to be, to some extent, what you described as the neutral version of pluralism, that you're different than me, you like different things than I do, and I'm going to put up with it. I'm going to tolerate it, which means I don't like it, but I'm not going to beat you over the head because of our difference. Is that distinct? Is there a meaningful distinction between saying we are a tolerant society and we are a pluralistic society in terms of values when we're talking about the neutral form of pluralism?
So I'm not sure that what I'm about to say is the truth about the words, but the thing that struck me as you were asking the question is that tolerance starts off as an individual perspective, an individual moral trait. Before we talk about a tolerant society, we talk about the attitude of tolerance on the part of a person, which, as you say, has a connotation of negative judgment. The question of whether I can tolerate something only arises in the first place if I have some reason to disapprove of it. So tolerance isn't celebration of the other. Tolerance is a way of engaging in spite of some reason for disapproval. I don't think pluralism is an individual character trait in the same way. Pluralism is an irreducibly social description. Tolerance could be, I think tolerance often is actually part of the social settlement that makes pluralism possible. It's not the case that in order to have a pluralistic society, we have to have constant mutual celebration. We have to have at least constant mutual tolerance. And then there will be some things that other people do, some ways of being that other people have, that we will have a more enthusiastic attitude about toward than tolerance. But sometimes pluralism means that we really deeply disagree. Sometimes tolerance means we're living alongside people whose beliefs, whose attitudes, whose ways of life we really deeply disapprove of. Tolerance is then the bedrock. We can't go below tolerance and still have a functionally pluralistic society. Does that distinction work?
Yes, I think so. And I think it fits with the way that I have argued for embracing pluralism as a as not just a description of society, but as a goal to aim at, and something, as you said earlier, to celebrate, um, that we should move beyond mere tolerance, or ideally move beyond mere tolerance, towards celebrating the fact that our society is not a monoculture, celebrating the fact that there are people out there who are doing things differently than you or I might choose to do them. And my longtime argument is that moving from beyond tolerance to celebration of pluralism strengthens our liberal institutions. Because if the reason that we're getting along is mere tolerance, then it's not too far to go from tolerance to intolerance. But it's a much further path from embrace of pluralism and like loving the fact that we have a pluralistic society to intolerance, to mass deportation now. Um, but when we talk about this kind of stuff, and this goes to, you can talk about it in the context of mass deportation now, if you were to go and ask the people who are waving those signs why it is that they're waving those signs, why it is that they think mass deportation is necessary, you might get a handful of like Daily Stormer or Stephen Miller types who are like, yup, I'm just like legitimately racist. I, just don't like people of a different skin color than me. I don't like people who speak different than me. Um, and I want to kick them out. But most people aren't going to say that. And I think a substantial number of the people who aren't going to say that, in fact, don't believe that about themselves, but will instead say things like, look, I think it's great that there are all kinds of different people. I think it's great that there are all kinds of different languages. I think it's great that there are all kinds of different values, but some values, some people are destructive in various ways to, say, our economy or our liberal institutions, or the ways of life that they want are genuinely bad and harmful. They'll give a story about why pluralism can't go to infinity. There have to be limits. There have to be things that we won't not only won't celebrate but won't tolerate. And this group of people, so the 15 million or to 20 million that Trump has been promising to deport, they fall into that camp. We might ask someone else, they might have a different category of people or behaviors. That how do we answer that question? Because in the abstract, that seems right. Like there can be behaviors you shouldn't tolerate, but it also can provide cover for rejecting pluralism, even as a virtue or a goal in the abstract.
So I think that there's an important difference between the politics of migration in the United States and the politics of migration in a lot of other Western liberal democracies, even though there are some important commonalities too. The argument you just laid out is an argument that people provide about Islamic immigration and the panic in nationalist European politics about the rise of refugee and asylum seekers from the Middle East over the course of the last 10 years after the Syrian civil war and so on, is presented in the terms you just described. Europe, as a Christian / post-Christian civilization, can't successfully tolerate and integrate Islamic immigration past a certain volume because of the difference in values that runs too deep. The most interesting instances of this are the kind of notionally liberal versions, kind of notionally feminist or pro-LGBTQ versions that we get, especially in the Netherlands. We can't sustain our feminist society. We can't sustain our gay tolerant society if we suddenly have a population coming in from the Middle East that isn't committed to those values. The version that we see in Hungary and elsewhere obviously doesn't have that feature to it, but it's still framed in terms of the values of the people who are coming in. And we saw some of that in the United States after 9/11, and we saw some of it in the first Trump campaign, which got a significant boost in late 2015 from the Paris attacks. And then the first act of Trump's anti-immigration presidency was the Muslim ban, the ban on 13 majority Muslim countries. But that's not the fundamental fact about American migration politics, and that's not what the mass deportation now signs were about. The mass deportation now signs are about migration from Latin America. And there's just not actually a story. There's not even a fictional story that mainly gets told about why Latin Americans, who are, after all, Catholic Christians almost entirely, why they have values or a way of life that is somehow deeply incompatible with American values or way of life. You threw into the list incompatibility with the existing economic order, which isn't a values question. That's a fear about so-called illegal immigration that has occasionally spiked over the course of the last 50, 60, 70 years. But the United States has now had a full employment economy for a decade. Indeed, has had labor shortages for meaningful parts of that time, and has had a full employment economy even with all of the levels of migration that the United States has been successfully managing and incorporating over that time. I don't think that the mass deportation now signs are a response to an economic shock that the migrants have provided. And I don't think it's a response to anything distinctive to Latin American ways of life or values. I think that it is a nationalistic urge that might not be presented in overtly racialist terms, like you correctly said, it would be from a Stephen Miller, but that aren't far from that. A phrase that I've heard over and over again since 2015, and that I admit completely caught me off guard when I first started hearing in 2015, is we won't have a country anymore. Or if you don't have borders, you don't have a country. Now, what does that mean? And I really struggled at first to talk with an interlocutor and say, what on earth do you mean by not having a country? I think what people mean in a fundamental sense is not having a nation. And having a nation in the American context here means something that is ethno-national, ethno-racial, and ethno-linguistic. That it just doesn't anymore count as an American nation if the population is too brown or too Spanish-speaking. Now, that has a whole lot of legacy having to do with racial diversity within the United States that is much older than the age of mass migration, that has to do with white-black politics within the United States. It calls on sources of American nationalism that have always been hostile to full equal membership for African Americans. But as an account of change over time, we won't have a country anymore. You don't have a country if you don't have borders. It's a claim that national identity could be stable, but isn't stable anymore because of the sheer volume of migration from Latin America, changing the national character, the ethno-national character of the so-called American nation. So mass deportation now, I think, is an urge to genuinely, just straightforwardly using this phrase, ethnic cleansing. It's not an urge to restore anything meaningful in a value system that is shared by people who were American citizens prior to 10 years ago or 20 years ago that are somehow not shared by the people who have been coming in across the southern border since then.
It's interesting how we use different categories as proxies for value differences. Because even there, I think if you pressed people and you said, well, what is it about Latin American migrants that you think is a problem? They're not going to specifically say the color of their skin. Some might say they don't speak English, but that's not going to be, I think, a primary aspect of it. They're going to speak in terms of something like values or some other characteristic of these cultures that undermines their vision of the nation or nationhood. And this seems to be a common theme in kind of anti-pluralistic talk is using which characteristics of a given person we or the anti-pluralists consider to be morally salient in terms of attaching an anti-pluralism judgment to them. So they're going to take away our nation is a judgment of like the set of values that they're bringing in, or they're going to oppose rights for gay people because of their religion is a value, and it's something that overlooks diversity among people. Like there are lots of Muslims who oppose rights for gay people, but there are lots of Muslims who don't. There are certainly Latin American immigrants who are not going to integrate into whatever it is America is, but there are lots of them who are. And at the same time, internal to the categories of people who imagine themselves to be the Heron folk, the nation, is diversity too. Like, we can frequently argue that someone like Ginny Thomas, who has dedicated herself in this crazed way to white Christian nationalism, fundamentally misunderstands basically all of the features of America.
So that last bit has actually proven to be really important in the politics of migration in the U.S. over the last decade because of this obsessive, albeit nonsense, claim. The Democrats are opening the borders, quote unquote. Democrats are opening the borders in order to get new Democratic voters. And this is lie stacked upon lie, the idea that people who are busy hiding from the immigration police and fearing deportation in the first place are going to illegally vote when there's very little illegal voting in the first place, but everyone who's going to illegally vote is not someone who's worried about deportation. But it's been a focus, and it's been a way of redefining everyone with whom conservatives and Republicans politically disagree. That is, the people already present in the United States, the already existing American citizens with whom they disagree, as being somehow outside the boundaries of the nation. Democrats are trying to win elections, so goes the claim, by getting un-American voters. Now, this is a standard move in populist politics. Take a fraction of the whole body politic, a fraction of the whole citizenry, and redefine it as being the real underlying whole. Those who aren't part of this fraction don't really count as part of the larger set. So if you're not a conservative Republican, you don't really count as an American in the first place. Democrats and liberals and urban elites and so on and so on all count as not really Americans to begin with. All the more reason why we suspect that the only way they have to win elections is by bringing in more people who aren't really Americans. So there's an acknowledgement of the diversity of the existing American populace at the same time as there's an attempt to anathematize it. You see, the people we disagree with, we recognize they exist, but they don't really count as Americans. And so we will assimilate them to the category of these fictional illegal voters who are being imported across the southern border.
A while back in conversation with a friend, he mentioned something that I have thought about a lot since in terms of pluralism and in terms of trying to convince people that they can live peacefully with each other in a pluralistic way, because a lot of anti-pluralism is feeling threatened, legitimately or often illegitimately, by the presence of these others and their other ways. And what he said was, we talk about one of the benefits that we talk about of pluralism is it enables self-authorship in in a deep way, that like we should want people to be able to craft their lives in the ways that best fit their needs and desires. And everyone's a little different. Everyone's ideal life will look a little different. And so your ability to author your life is important. And we should seek to kind of maximize that and respect that, as you then respect it for others. And that is, there's like a negative liberty sense to that of, if you really want to be into Marvel Comics, I'm not going to stop you from being into Marvel Comics. But we're social animals. Our lives are lived in a social context. And one of the things that means is that if there are a lot of ways of living that require a critical mass of other people wanting to live that same way in order to achieve them. So if you want to be Catholic and you want to live in a deeply Catholic way, that is challenging if there are no Catholics within 100 miles of you and you don't have access to a Catholic church and so on. Or you want to live in what we might consider like a traditionally conservative, you want to Wendell-Berry it up. And if there's no one else who wants to live that way, it's going to be hard, and you're not going to feel like you have the kind of self-authorship of someone who sees their cultural preferences more widely reflected. And so for a lot of people, if they see their particular way of life being decentered in the culture, that feels like their way of life is being taken away from them in this kind of anti-pluralistic, like, no, you pretend that I can live the way I wanted to, but you really have taken it away from me because you've taken away access to a critical mass of fellow people.
Right.
And so how do we, that doesn't seem crazy to feel that way. But it also it does clearly exist in tension with both pluralism as diversity, because if there's sufficient diversity, then the number of people living any one way is going to be smaller. And diversity over time, because if this is the way you want to live and you want these people, and then things change, some of those people will change as well. And that seems to play into like immigration concerns too. There's this sense of like, our way of living was this, and now if enough people who are different come in, there won't be as many people committed to that particular way of living. How do we address that in this context? Or is there a way to ameliorate that concern without basically giving up liberalism along the way?
Great. I want to express ambivalence about self-authorship. And I think you and I are not on the same page about this. Now, ambivalence means ambivalence. This is not a passive-aggressive way of saying criticism. But a lot of the things that a lot of people want to do with their lives, they don't want to be creating. I would venture to say, most of what most of us do with our lives most of the time, we want to be able to, as it were, already speak a moral and normative language that has already come into existence without us. That doesn't mean we want to be restrained if we would have a moment of seeking to change it, but we are not in the business of constant self-recreation about everything. And to aggressively, affirmatively value self-authorship, that's one of the ways in which liberal society can come to look legitimately threatening to people who lead lots of traditional ways of life. It's a public story that gets told. We don't believe you're really free if you happen to be believing the religion that you were raised in. You're trying to...
Yeah, let me. So I think you are right that it's a problem if it's framed that way. But I don't think that that's actually the right way to frame it I think there's a better way to frame it that addresses that concern. And that is that we don't need to pitch self-authorship as a radical and constantly ongoing process of self-creation and recreation, but rather as a capacity to revise as needed,
Right.
and a capacity to choose from an existing menu. And
Mhm.
so the analogy that I thought of as you were saying that is, there are a lot of, if we talk about literal authorship, there are a lot of authors out there who get started writing fan fiction and then pivot into writing incredibly formulaic genre fiction. They've
Right.
picked out I'm going to write teen paranormal romances, or I'm going to write hard-boiled detective. And these are like extremely well-defined. Like if I say, hey, I just wrote a novel that is a like across the board hard-boiled detective novel, you could immediately start telling me all sorts of things about my book that would
Mhm.
probably be true without ever having looked at it. Um, and so you picking from this menu, and many authors are then quite happy to spend their entire careers just writing in that formula and just reading in that formula. And then some will do interesting new things within that formula and push it in new directions or do something experimental on the margin. And then some will head off in radically new directions. But all of that feels like self-authorship, in the sense that they are authoring in a way that they themselves chose, even if that choosing was heavily influenced by, like, I'm really into this genre because I grew up reading it because my dad had a big collection of it. Like, it was a culturally embedded or socially embedded choice, and not just a picking, like a blank slate picking from a menu. Um, but that feels like self-authorship, and that feels like liberal self-authorship in a way that routes around the concern that you just raised about presenting it in this like overly stark, dramatic, like, go forth into a wide world with nothing to base your decisions on.
Yeah, yeah. Now we're closing the gap. Um, I'd still want to emphasize, as it were, how much good storytelling is done in the world of a repertoire of familiar stories, and how little experimentalism, just as such, is a sign of good authorship. Obviously, there's something in the combination of originality and excellence that's really wonderful. Obviously, there's a lot of really miserable, um, utterly formulaic genre story. But most stories are stories from among the repertoire of stories. And we don't use the belittling words of genre and formulaic to talk about how just most good storytelling is relatively familiar. Most people's lives, to the degree that we want to characterize what they're doing with their lives as creating the story of their lives, are not radically experimentalist, and they're not necessarily better when they go radically experimentalist, and they're not necessarily worse when they're operating within the repertoire of existing stories. So if all of that's right, and if that's all that we mean by self-authorship, then I'll go along with it for current purposes. But I think it often means the other thing, and so it makes me a little nervous. So it's good for there to be a menu. It's good for there to be a repertoire, a range of things that a person can integrate into their lives and integrate into their revisions of their lives as they go. To that extent, yep, diversity and pluralism are assets for the ability of a person to lead their life. But that diversity and pluralism has to not end up as a homogenized mixture. There have to meaningfully be still different life choices that are available. And as you said, uh, that's an issue if you lose access to existing traditionalist or existing religious or existing uh, continuous communities, though it's also the case for people who are doing other things. The question of whether I can live a life as a gay man, leading a life that has, as it were, the full range of things that one does with one's life, to be able to marry and raise children, to be able to live in a sense of community, to be able to be out in the world, not just to be out in with the capital O, but to be part of a community in which I can introduce people to my husband, and uh, that depends on a critical mass of other people. It's not something I can do by myself. It's not even something that two people can do by themselves. And certainly by the time you say to be able to find a suitable life partner or romantic partner from among a range of other people, rather than there only being two of us in the same space, that requires a critical mass. And so in the decades, when across most of the United States, homosexuality was criminalized and across almost all of it was deeply socially stigmatized, you saw tremendous sorting migration into a handful of cities where it became possible to lead those lives with a critical mass of other people. We need other people to be telling stories that are compatible with our stories. We need enough of them around that we can opt into what it is that they're doing. This is a kind of thing that I've talked about a lot in both my multiculturalism book and my pluralism book, the ability to sustain communities in which we can live our freely lived lives. So then to get back to where you were trying to go with all of this, those things can erode. A particular community can erode by an influx of other new people. And to the degree that my ability to live my free life depends on our ability to lead a life that makes sense to us together. Yes, it is absolutely the case that the dynamism of a diverse free society where people can move around and people can move in can be a source of threat. I think it's absolutely the case that that's a source for a small c conservatism, culturally and socially, even before we rise to the level of anti-pluralistic or populistic or nationalistic politics. But it's one of the resources that kind of politics can always draw on.
So what do you do about it? Because we don't, because as I said, the solution is not to say, well, you want your trad Catholic lifestyle, so what we're going to do is forcibly prevent anyone who is not Catholic from moving in, and we're going to forcibly prevent anyone who's already in from expressing opposition to Catholicism. That's incompatible with liberalism. Or we're not going to say gay people sorted geographically into, a lot of them moved to San Francisco, and now San Francisco passes a law saying you can only move into the city if you are either gay or a ally. Like that would be
Right.
a weird anti-liberal sort of thing. But if we don't do that,
the Lord knows San Francisco will latch onto any excuse for NIMBY politics.
Yes. No, we don't need to give them another one. But yeah, like without being able to do that, how do we address the concerns that you just discussed?
I'm not much of a solutions person. By that, I don't mean that I don't try to look for ways to make progress or make things better, but I don't much believe in formulae that solve problems. This is part of what's difficult about politics in liberal societies, this interplay between the diversity that we need to draw on and the difficulty of sustaining that diversity in the face of constant erosion and mixing at the margins. There are things that we can do. There are pluralism-friendly institutions and practices that we can pursue. We can pursue relatively robust freedom of religion and freedom of association. We can continue to, as the United States does more than a lot of other countries, allow the maintenance of private school systems that can have intellectual content and moral content that's not the same as the content of the state school system. We can have, again, as we do in the United States, a variety of kinds of exemptions for faith and religious communities from laws that would mandate the application of pure anti-discrimination rules to the internal life of religious associations. Those are tools for making sure that diverse pluralistic communities can retain enough of their differentiation from the wider society and retain enough of their coherence to be able to survive over time and maybe to diminish the sense of threat. But you're not going to be able to do that for each and every community within a pluralistic order, and the dynamism of diversity happens faster than your legal institutions and legal practices are going to be able to carve out special supports for. To some extent, geographic decentralization is a standard tool. I'm not someone who thinks that federalism is a particularly important part of that story, because I think American states are much too big to serve as that kind of cultural or associational community without tremendous internal injustice to all of the people within an American state who don't subscribe to the same doctrine. But a degree of town or local or city self-government can do something. So too can the ability to geographically sort into things like homeowners associations or neighborhoods that have defined characters as neighborhoods. But then that raises the risk that I just alluded to about San Francisco, where the cultural conservatism interacts with the kind of economic pulling up the drawbridge that characterizes NIMBYism. And those are both genuine dynamics of NIMBYism, that we don't want outside people and we don't want the loss of our property values. And you get a toxic kind of politics that emerges there. So in some sense, there's nothing for it but to keep trying to urge people to be able to live with the tension. That is, there's not a formula of liberal politics that once and for all is going to allow us to associationally sort or geographically sort, because in every moment and in every year and in every generation, some people are moving out and some people are moving in. And some people within our community are experiencing a kind of desire to reshape it. And some people are seeking to join part of our community, but not the whole thing. Given that those margins are never stable, given the boundaries are constantly eroding if people have any freedom to choose and freedom to move at all, you don't get to say with safety, right, we've got our community thoroughly encased in amber and it will never transform anymore. There has to be a political and moral willingness to face change, and a recognition that at the level of the nation state, at least, there's no hope of, with any kind of stability or any kind of political and moral decency, imposing the homogenous vision that you think that you have. You can't solve your local problem. We here in our congregation find that our believers are slipping away by going to the highest of levels and say, so in order to solve that problem, we will embrace Christian nationalism and try to force our congregation's views onto 300 million people. You just need to teach people political values to be able to draw a distinction there and say, of all of the ways that you think that you're called on to preserve your congregation from the loss of believers, among them can't be forcing your doctrine on 300 million people and redefining the American nation as if it is the same as your congregation.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, here's a preview of the next episode of Reimagining Liberty, currently in early access for supporters.
It's very easy to get emotional and to get lost in your own emotions and your own social threat about what other people are accusing you of. Is just to return to liberal fundamentals, to fundamental rights of humanity, the importance of democracy, your particular understanding of some of the theory we talked about in terms of economic history, like what actually works. And just get your head out of the debate, get your head out of the noise of social media and focus on the truth.
If you'd like to listen to that conversation right now, You can by becoming a Reimagining Liberty supporter. Head to reimaginingliberty.com and click on Early Access to learn more.